Welcome back. This is a lecture on myth and ritual. And so what we have here is a collection of stories that we're going to talk about. So here is the idea of a myth. So in anthropology, we do not use myth as a falsehood, but instead we talk about it in a number of ways. So you could see here, I have bulleted 4 different ways. So myths are stories that recount how various aspects of the world came to be. The power of myths come from their ability to make life meaningful for those who accept it or accept the myth. So as bullet 1 suggests, that a conventional definition here involves or emphasizes that they are stories about sacred, as is defined among the particular people. Often these stories are about beginnings of the natural world, the social world, or even the cosmos, or about endings of time, of humanity, of the deities, or the cosmos itself. Second, we'll talk about myth as a term that can be referred to stories that are used to validate power relations. So that, for example, in ancient Egypt, all of the gods and the kings are in some way related. So that the king was always part of the sacred group. But the idea of these stories is to make the social appear both natural and pre-existent. Also, we see that myths can be performances, products of high verbal art. You see that actually, myths are very much part of the telling of the power structure. So those in the power structure, they're actually specialists, if you will, that are master storytellers that talk about the events of the moment or of the future. And finally, stories about how to live, and that is that they tell people where they have come from and where they're going, and thus how they should live right now. So there are other ways to look at myths. We have Clifford Geertz in my first bullet here, his famous declaration that myths are stories we tell about ourselves. Okay. Now, we also have a reference here to Claude Lévi-Strauss in the second bullet. And in the mid-50s, in a series of books and articles, this French anthropologist started to transform the study of myth. What he did was he argued that myths have a meaningful structure that are worth studying in their own right, apart from the uses to which myth may be put to. He suggested that myths should be interpreted for their basic structure, and he says that myths are tools for overcoming the logical contradictions that cannot otherwise be overcome. So what he's talking about is that there are events in life, and I give you some here. The problems of living in opposition, culture versus nature, birth versus death, or life to death. The idea here is that the myth will give you a suspension, a moment of relief, in so much as the story suspends the irresolvable opposition here. So in the Western world, for example, we might say that the opposition of life and death is often thought in terms of death and resurrection, or an afterlife, some life that allows us to transcend death. In other societies, you might find the myth describing the journey of a bird that travels from Earth, the home of the living, to the sky, the home of the dead. And not unlike what I just referred to as the Western idea of how to resolve this notion of life and death. So from this standpoint, myths are not just something to talk about the world as it is, but also describe the world as it might be. So to paraphrase Levi-Strauss, myths are good to think. Mythic thinking can propose other ways to live our lives. And the myths themselves actually give us that suspension of tension that I talked to earlier. Levi-Strauss insists that alternative myths propose an ordinary rejection, meaning that alternative myths propose are rejected as impossible, though myths allow for us to play with these self-evident truths, and this is important. So, is Levi-Strauss correct? A lot of debate since his publication in 1955 of this infamous article, The Structural Study of Myth. But anthropologists today often see that ordinary members of life, of society, are very much aware of how their myths structure meaning, allowing them to manipulate the way myths are told or interpreted in order to make an effect, to prove a point, or to buttress a particular referential perspective on human nature or society or even history. Now here's, I wanted to blow up an idea of the American mythic structure. Something I might add here is rugged individualism as part of a mythic structure. When I say others, so you could see religious freedom. If you looked at this from an academic standpoint, looked at the literature, you'd say, well, you know, how really free is religion? But here, this is much more evident in the literature right now. Land of opportunity. This is a huge part of the mythic structure of American life. But we now have ample research regarding the inequalities in American life. We also have a notion of American exceptionalism. This comes from way back on this notion of a city upon a hill in a 1630 sermon. And we could see land of charity, unity, affection, God's country, a chosen people, all of this. Actually, I could read to you, but for the sake of time, a passage from Ronald Reagan's, one of his inaugural speeches, that you might as well have thought was written by John Winthrop himself, in terms of this notion of this being a special place from sea to sea. And again, any others, and that's where I brought up rugged individualism, this idea of people pulling themselves up by the bootstraps, the Horatio Alger stories. These are stories from many decades ago of people who go from rag to riches. We have these stories now in terms of maybe in the 80s, the notion of the tech, lone tech inventor or innovator in the garage building a multi-billion-dollar corporation. And you could see here that these are codified in drawings that might be placed around an elementary school. They give a sort of representation to the idea of religious freedom. Here's one, the land of opportunity, coming ashore with this brightness of optimism on the face. And again, here's the Ronald Reagan speech. So we can look at it a bit if you want. And he says, I've spoken of the shining hill, the shining city all my political life, but I don't know if I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. But in my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks, stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds, living in harmony and peace, a city with free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here. That's how I saw it and see it still. Again, this might as well have been written by John Winthrop. You can see the references to these mythic notions that we keep in our mind, and it becomes the part and parcel of political speech. Ritual is really made up of 4 distinct parts, and ritual as a repetitive social practice is composed of a sequence of symbolic activities in the form of dance, song, speech, gesture. Ritual is really part of a social practice that is also set off from the routines of everyday life. Also, people will know that the ritual that is going on is in fact, the activity is in fact a ritual, even if they haven't seen it before, because ritual has a very certain scheme. And finally, ritual is encoded in a narrative myth. Let me give you an example of a ritual that we're all familiar with. And again, this is something that you have either heard of or participated in yourself, and that is a birthday party. Now, this is going to sound a little trivial, but it really gives us some good insight. So consider a child's birthday party in the United States. So first we get several children are invited to celebrate the party, the birthday, and each arrives with a wrapped gift, which is handed to the birthday child and then set aside. The children put on hats or whatever other things they do, and then they play some type of games, and these games culminate in the appearance of the birthday cake, right? So the cake is illuminated by candles, typically one for each year of the child's life, and everybody sings happy birthday. And the child makes a wish, blows out the candles. And following the candles, there might be ice cream, the cake rather, some ice cream, and the birthday child opens the presents. And there's much commotion, and the guests are urging the birthday child to open theirs, and etc. You got the idea. All right, so what is happening here? Well, first, the central events of the party, the giving of the gifts, the events associated with the cake, candles, the wish, the singing of happy birthday, and the opening of the gifts. They all occur in that order. And the birthday party, children now are learning certain things, the importance of moments in life. Okay, so what do they learn? They associate a gift with important moments. The second thing they learn is the importance of exchange, of material object in defining the social relationship. All right. Third, they learn some delayed gratification because the presents are not opened immediately or opened quickly. Fourth, they live out patterns of sociability. They recognize the value of the individual. It's a celebration of the self. And finally, they learn some patterns of sharing. So that's an idea of how ritual might actually be put in place in terms of some myth in American life. The individual, the value of the individual, and the aspect of being sociable as a group. Thank you. So we talk about rites of passage, and this is really a notion of moving from one idea to one status to another, graduating from college, getting married, joining the military. This is a life cycle ritual. But let me go back to the notion of ritual as a process that is encoded in myth. And I want to do that by giving you a sense of the very value of a birthday party. So I'm having trouble getting back. Let me look at this process here as one of